Dembash, everyone. Hon bkhair hatin. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining our event tonight or today, wherever you are. My name is Dilar Dirik. I'm a member of JENI, Kurdish Women's Office for Peace, and also a postdoctoral researcher at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. I have the honor of moderating this session on democratic confederalism, construction and resistance. This is an event that is jointly organized by Civaka Azad and JENI, Kurdish Women's Office for Peace. Civaka Azad is a Kurdish information center based in Germany, and JENI, also based in Germany, is an office of the women's movement, the Kurdish women's movement, that is part of the women's movement's efforts of unifying women's struggles around the world. Both institutions are based in Germany, but their work is not limited to that. We're now live streaming on YouTube, but the recording will be available on YouTube after the event on the Civaka Azad YouTube channel. So people who are joining now may have heard about Democratic Confederalism, a proposal by the Kurdish Freedom Movement to people around the world, especially in recent years because of the development of the revolution in Rojava, northern Syria. Democratic Confederalism is based on the model of ideas of the Kurdish political leader and thinker Abdullah Ocalan, who's one of the founders of the Kurdistan Workers Party. Öcalan has been in prison since 1999, following an international NATO-led operation that led to his abduction and later his imprisonment. He has been imprisoned ever since on the prison island of İmralı by the Turkish state. Millions of people consider him as a political leader, but also as a thinker who has much to contribute to our understanding of democracy and liberation. He's also the negotiator in the talks between the Kurdish Freedom Movement and the Turkish state. In 2013, he initiated a peace process that lasted until 2015 with the Turkish state. But when it collapsed in 2015, which led to one of the violent episodes of the war in northern Kurdistan and Turkey, he has been subjected to a policy of isolation on İmralı prison island. And as many human rights activists, international lawyers, intellectuals, and politicians around the world have noted, his isolation actually amounts to torture according to Turkish, European, and international law. It has been protested by many people around the world in various ways, and most recently led to a mass hunger strike by political prisoners in Turkish jails. Democratic Confederalism, so in this sense, not only stands for resistance against war, chaos, fascism, and colonization in the Middle East, but also for the construction of social alternatives that can become regional or even global perspectives for democracy and freedom. It is based on a paradigm of ecology, grassroots or radical democracy, and women's liberation. And in this introductory event, which is part of the many political education efforts that we have seen on the rise since the outbreak and spread of COVID-19, we want to speak to two people who are very much, who have been part of the circulation of these ideas. And before we start, I think we also want to acknowledge that around the world currently there are very powerful protests going on following the brutal killing, the murder of George Floyd. So I think this should also be an occasion for us to salute the Black liberation struggle, which is of course a very inspiring and important struggle for liberation today. So I'm very happy to introduce two brilliant women who will speak to us about democratic confederalism, not only as a theory and practice, but also its relevance for the left around the world today. This is a relatively short event, and our speakers will be asked a set of questions that we have prepared for them. Hopefully they can stick to answering each of them in between 6 to 7 minutes. And at the end, we will have time for questions from people who are watching us right now. So please make sure you make use of the comment section on YouTube. You can write your questions on there and we will try to make sure we can answer most of them at least. I will now introduce our speakers. Havin Güneşer is an engineer, journalist, and Kurdish women's activist. She's one of the spokespersons of the international initiative, Freedom for Abdullah Ocalan, Peace in Kurdistan. And she's also the translator of several of Abdullah Ocalan's books. Most recently, The Sociology of Freedom, which has just now come out very recently. I will mention it again at the very end. This is the third volume of Abdullah Ocalan's 5-volume manifesto for a democratic civilization. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, The Art of Freedom, A Brief History of the Kurdish Liberation Struggle, and that's available at the moment for pre-order on PM Press. Janet Beale is an author based in the United States. She's the author of numerous articles and books on topics related to social ecology, including Ecology or Catastrophe, The Life of Murray Bookchin. Janet is also the translator of several books related to the Kurdish freedom movement, such as Democratic Autonomy in Northern Kurdistan, The Revolution in Rojava, and most recently the 3-volume autobiography of Sakine Cansız, who is one of the co-founders of the Kurdistan Workers Party and also a historic figure in the development of the Kurdish women's movement. So I will mention all of these books again at the very end, so you can write them down, order them, buy them, read them, and share them. And now we will start with our questions to our speakers. The first question is for Havin. So the Kurdish freedom movement today is building up the concept of democratic confederalism. How did this paradigm shift come about, and which external and internal factors led to this? Havin.
Thank you, Dilar, and Janet, and everybody else. It's really great to be with everybody tonight. And I guess, you know, it's a bit of a short time, of course, to discuss such an important topic, which is very, very current on everybody's agenda, not only the Kurdish peoples, but everyone around the world, actually looking for an alternative to the oppression, the colonization, the racism, nationalism, religionism, sexism, you know, and also, of course, the ecological destruction and that we are facing currently. So, but if I'm to, I guess the best way to handle the 6-7 minutes is maybe to point to some direction, like you did at the beginning, to talk about, you know, which books we can actually read more on them, about the topics that we are about to bring up tonight. So we are, as all of us can see from where we are standing today, there is a huge historical moment that we are in, which is very significant, which makes it very clear to us that either we will, and not either actually, we will, by doing the struggle and the building of the new, which the principles and the framework that we'll talk about today a little bit, you know, we can overcome this exploitation and colonization process. So, but of course, things weren't as clear throughout the time. I guess, especially with the formation of the PKK, although, you know, it was an amazing 100 years full of hope, but at the same time, the collapse of the hope and all the struggles that went into the creation of hopes like the Soviet Union and other places around the world, it was also complicated. You know, then there was the rise of feminism, ecological movements, and etc. So therefore, and the 68 movement, of course, the wave of the 68 youth around the world, which also, of course, influenced the PKK and Abdullah Ocalan at the time and his friends. So as a result, you know, when we look at the formation from the group to the present, to talk about the external and internal factors, because as you know, to talk about why and how are two different issues. You know, why is actually the external and the internal factors, that brought us to this momentum. The PKK and Abdullah Öcalan as well, the reasons why he came to the point, um, as to come up with this philosophy of democratic modernity, democratic confederalism, and all the other concepts. And of course, in that, as I said, during what happened during these 40, 45, 50 years is amazingly important. The collapse of real socialism actually pushed everyone, or mostly everyone, to abandon perhaps fostering the hope that a change and a life outside of this world system as we know it today is possible. And of course, the national liberation movements and their praxis was also not really creating much hope, because they went to square one as well with a lot of the stuff that was, that they critiqued as well. But of course, there were the positive aspects of this, because being a dynamic movement, there were lessons being learned from all of this. And of course, during this time, we saw the rise of feminism, and as I said, the ecologic movements as well. Now, of course, there were the internal factors, which were internal to the movement itself. The inadequacies experienced, theoretically thinking something, but the practice coming out in another way. Therefore, learning from doing, and then reflecting it into theory was also was an internal factor that led to this. The Leninist party structure not really meeting the needs of the struggle, the tendency for power hierarchy that was developing already without actually coming to power, let's say. Women's continued both struggle for freedom, but also continued exploitation, and the role of women and men in this, already within the movement, but also within the society as well. And then there was, of course, the internal factors that were specific to the region. Kurdistan were 4 parts, colonized by 4 different states, but it wasn't only a colony of these 4 states, actually. We saw as the struggle grew and grew that this was an internationally agreed colony, So the moment you were struggling against, let's say, the Turkish army and state, but you had NATO there, let's say and we can see this right now here as well. You're struggling with Syria, let's say, to make a change, but then comes in Iran, Russia, US and Turkey and everybody else. So therefore, we are really talking about the foundation of capitalist modernity, that Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement, the PKK, faced very nakedly just before their eyes, because even like before the collapse of real socialism, Soviet Union wasn't really supportive either. So I guess, Öcalan and the movement they could really see this very clearly, the regime itself, the world system itself. And this led to a very profound confinement and suppression of the Kurds, and it's still, I guess, not shattered completely, although it's shattered quite a bit to make their voices heard. But this has created so many layers of prejudice there. So I guess let's keep in mind, and I think my 6 or 7 minutes is almost up. But let's keep in mind as a result that change, and especially paradigm shift, don't happen overnight. I have to say, along with these external and internal factors, and we have to also, of course, bring into discussion the New World Order and the Third World War that Öcalan has been talking about quite a bit. since his abduction, which was actually done, as you mentioned, by not only NATO, but also Russia, Israel, all together to prepare the ground for this Third World War and New World Order, so that there are actually no organized movements that are progressive enough to resist this, and that they're organized. And so I think all these things that I've been mentioning, they may sound negative, but I think they were just so positive in the sense that both Öcalan and the movement were not dogmatic, and they were trying to understand the problems, the failed attempts to overcome them, and why they were so failed, and to draw from that and so there was this continuous change and transformation anyway, So, but I think what's really, really important is that there was no rupture yet completely with the civilization and the modernity. There was all these precursors in terms of women's freedom, in terms of grassroots organization, in terms of class struggle, power struggle to diminish that. But the actual important rupture came after Öcalan's abduction. And I think here maybe it's really good that Janet can come in, because I think this powerful intersection of this whole, there's so many dimensions that I'm talking about, and what Janet and Mari Bookchin and social ecology went through together really intersected well to at least draw some conclusions that were very important.
Thank you so much, Shavin. I know that the questions that I'm asking are opening, as you said, one door and yet another door. So thank you for trying to answer them as much as possible. The next question is for Janet. As Havin also mentioned, Murray Bookchin's ideas, his theories have had a great influence on the Kurdish freedom movement and on Abdullah Öcalan. So can you speak a little bit about the discussion of freedom and radical democracy in Murray Bookchin's work?
It's fascinating listening to Havin speak about what's happening in Kurdistan. In another part of the world, in the United States, Murray wrote his important writings from the 1950s until the early 2000s. And I was his partner and collaborator from the late 1980s until he died in the early 2000s. He's writing in a very different context. And it's really fascinating, Dilar, that you ask about freedom. Because in the context where he was writing, the concept of freedom was quite, in some ways, historically bizarre. Yes, we think of freedom in the United States as freedom from an oppressor. And that is a very real thing. America rebelled against England to get its freedom from Great Britain. Colonies rebel against their oppressors. People rebel against authoritarian states. All these things this is a very important concept of freedom, to be free from oppression. People today around the world are trying to be free from white supremacy, women trying to be free from men. Freedom from domination is extremely important, but it's not the whole story. Because when taken to an extreme, as it is in the United States, it can lead to its own pathologies. In the United States, it's led to a concept of freedom that identifies it with rugged individualism. And this is a concept that Bookchin was extremely critical of, individualism, because he said that the concept of the American individual not only justified free enterprise and was the basis of the capitalist development here, but it also was a perversion. It cut the individual off from society. The person, the lone, rugged individual wandering through the wilderness and the frontier and killing Indians and not having any tolerance for anything he disagreed with. This is the kind of individualism that was prized here. But as I said, but Bookchin said this is a pathological development of a very real moment in freedom that becomes toxic because you're cut off from society. And he said that freedom, real, true freedom, it involves, it's a recognition of the fact that we are social creatures. All human beings are social. We have to be embedded in society. And we need to have a concept of freedom that recognizes and permits and encourages our embeddedness in our communities. And he used, and only then can our real individuality, as he called it, as opposed to individualism, only then can our true individuality develop in the context of living in community. Only then can we make our contributions. Only then can we, because the rugged individual out there, he used to say, it's like an onion. You peel away the layers of the onion and there's nothing inside. And that's why they have to keep dominating people to try to feel alive and real. But if you're embedded in a community, and having face-to-face interactions with people, that's when you have a sense of really who you are. That's when you're not an onion anymore, but you're a person with an inner life, with a character, and with a sense of strength and empowerment. So he wanted in some ways, in the years since he's died, I've thought very often that this is key to understanding his work, because in the 1950s, he saw that the United States was becoming a very Washington-centric, very much dominated economically, governmentally, by the center. And he thought that in order for people to truly fulfill that individuality, we needed to become free from the domination of the central nation state. So he shifted from his Marxist path to becoming an anarchist, which he later redefined as communalist. And looked for ways that society could be decentralized. He wanted society to be decentralized economically, technologically, in terms of energy and all kinds of ways, and not least politically. So starting in the 50s, he looked around and said, how can we decentralize society politically? And he read a book about the ancient Athenian, the citizens' assemblies of ancient Athens, and he said, it's been done once, we can do it again. And of course, the Athenian assemblies were very much compromised by the fact that they excluded women, they excluded non-Athenians. There were all kinds of exclusions from the assembly. But he said, wait a minute, we don't need to say that face-to-face democracy is bad because of that historical defect. We can look at the concept. We can drag it out of the historical muck and mire and say, here is a principle, here is a kind of institution that can become the bed for freedom. He used in a 1968 essay, he used the word forms of freedom. In other words, freedom isn't just people running wild on their own. There has to be a freedom has to be embedded in an institution. And he thought that these communal, horizontal, face-to-face institutions, including this political one, would be the way to guarantee individuality and freedom. And so he spent the rest of his adult life elaborating this, and starting in the 50s and elaborating it until it became very detailed. The other essential piece that he added onto it was what to do about broader areas, because a citizens' assembly is very good in a town or in an urban neighborhood. But what about broader areas? You can't have a citizens' assembly that has 500,000 people or 1 million people meeting. So he found another example from history. In this case, it was the history of the CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, created by the Spanish anarchists, which was very much inspiring to him, because he saw that it was an institution that had base layers like assemblies, and then there were different confederal layers in this confederation, and the people from the base in the assemblies would send delegates to the next layer up from assemblies in one area. And then those delegates for an even larger area would choose delegates for the next confederal layer up, and so on, and for maybe, I think, 4 or 5 layers. And the essential thing about this type of confederation was that it was intent, because it was anarchist in orientation, it was intent on preserving the flow of power from the bottom up. So you can look at another example in Russia, where the Soviets had been created by the Russian Revolution. That too was a lot of layers from the base up to Moscow, up to St. Petersburg. But that was a format for a top-down rule. It just was like a waterfall. Power flowed from the top down. This set of layers that the anarchists made was a way of preserving the flow of power from the bottom up and ensuring that top-down thing, like happened in the Soviet Union, wouldn't happen. So the delegates had to be mandated from below. That meant it wasn't like a delegate wasn't somebody who could like go off to a confederal council meeting and make their own decisions. No, what they had to do was carry the mandate of the base, and that happened at every level. And if they failed to carry the mandate of the base, they could be recalled and replaced with somebody who would carry out the mandate of the base. And so this confederal layer was very important. It's a way of having an assembly democracy over a widespread area. And he called this set of ideas by the extremely cumbersome name of libertarian municipalism, but that's what he called it. So, okay. He also sometimes called it communalism for short. And he saw this as a way that people in assemblies could deliberate and educate themselves about issues and argue and take stands and develop positions in the absence of a nation state, which reduced people just to passive sheep and stripped away those powers. So I think I've come to the end of this segment. So over to you, Dilar.
Thank you so much, Janet. Also, likewise, as I just said to Havin as well, there's a lot to be said. So thank you so much for trying to give us a brief summary. So I'll go back to some of the things that Havin has mentioned. So you've described the conditions in which democratic confederalism, the paradigm shift in the Kurdish freedom movement have come about. So can you explain in a bit more detail what are the principles, the dimensions of democratic confederalism? What kind of system is it, and what kind of social and political theories have shaped this concept?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I actually answered the why of the question you posed, but not the how of the question very shortly. I don't want anyone to think, and maybe some of those who are listening to us already know how it was an extremely difficult transformation, and that transformation continues to date, because it is a continuous revolution of the moment. It's not an overnight thing. But you need to overcome all these pre-formed personality traits, mechanisms, institutions, the media that is there 24 hours a day, and trying to make sure that nobody deviates, So therefore, it's been an extremely difficult transformation. And as I said, we need to look at this transition that took place from 98, 99 onwards. So the situation was not like today, where everybody is more and more clear about how we are all governed and colonized. Even if it is people who have a nation state, they can also see as people, as the subjects of that nation state, how they too are colonized. But I think it required a huge trust, which accumulated over the years between Öcalan and the Kurdish people, and between Öcalan and his movement. And it also required a vision, of course. He didn't just say, this is really bad, forget about this, but he also put a vision in front of everybody of a return to enchantment of life, a return to joy, a return to a time and a place where, oppression and exploitation can be overcome, that it's not fate, And he wrote many books to show that, actually. And as you pointed out, we are translating some of those books, and hopefully more will come out. But he also had a lot of courage, to be able to, back in 99, when you're abducted, when everybody's telling you that you've lost it, that your leader has now given it up, surrendered, that you insist on this and you show the courage to tell people, and with the responsibility that no, this is how it is. So I think this is very important to also consider, to see that things don't happen overnight, and people don't listen to one another sheepishly, but it comes through a process of struggling together, etc. So, but I want to come to, of course, democratic confederalism. But I think we democratic confederalism needs to be discussed even wider, because I see a lot of people just talking about democratic confederalism as if it's possible to talk about it without talking about democratic modernity. We really need to question and critique the modernity we are in, which we call capitalist modernity. We are not rejecting modernity altogether, but we are rejecting this modernity, and defining our own alternative modernity, which Öcalan conceptualizes it as democratic modernity. So democratic confederalism is one of the three pillars of this democratic modernity. So we can't do democratic confederalism if the other two pillars are not really discussed often enough. The other two pillars I will just shortly mention is the moral and political society. We need to see what has been done to our society at large. Of course, the Kurds need to look back and see what has been happening to the Kurdish society, how its organic way of development has been completely crushed, and how it's been completely, being killed, actually. It's like your arms, legs, and your feelings, and your brain, and your, whatever doesn't work anymore, because everyone is taking a piece and taking it somewhere and exploiting it, and reforming you in a different manner. So therefore, Öcalan talks a lot about society side, and maybe Kurds are living this at most extremes, but all societies are experiencing this. Maybe Kurds, the other indigenous peoples, the different peoples that have been basically physically annihilated, are more visibly living this, but most of the societies are losing this texture of being moral and being political. And of course, the third pillar is the ecologic industry. Well, this paradigm is not looking at industry as if it's a monster, but it is looking at industry that works hand in hand with ecology and economy. So therefore, I think, if we detach that from that, it is not going to be possible to understand what democratic confederalism is. So it is not an alternative state, but it is alternative to the state, which I always say wherever I go. Very important to understand this, so we don't turn it into such mechanisms, and that we never ignore the other two pillars of this. Therefore, there is a really need, a very in-depth need to understand what the state is, and especially what the nation state is and what it has been doing. It's in terms of its role in gender roles, sexism, in terms of homogenization of the society, in terms of how it's colonizing our moral, cultural, and material resources. Is it too long now? I think it looks, by the look of it, it's too long. But let me say that it has to be based on this moral and political society, on democratic politics. This is extremely important, which means democratic governance and control of social matters. And to be able to achieve that, you need multi-layered organizations, you know. And we're not just talking about the commune at the very bottom in the grassroots. We are talking about, at the commune level, all those who are oppressed and exploited and colonized to be organized, you know. So this is how the commune then comes about, that with all these different parts to it, you know. And self-defense. I mean, self-defense doesn't mean only militarily, but also in many different ways, especially media, you know, and other democratic organs. You know, we can talk about health, we can talk about, you know, many different aspects. And also, I have to underline, Öcalan is very, very particular with this. There should be no ideological hegemony, you know, as long as they do not erode the moral and political structure. Now, I have to very quickly go through the socio-political theories. I think this is very important. I think here Bookchin comes in, and the book State Violence, Beyond State Violence and Power is very, very important at that. Öcalan's huge discussion with Bookchin, especially one could see, I guess, in this book, it was very fundamental, I guess, because it kind of constituted a center around which he systematized his thoughts around. So social ecology, in that sense, was extremely fundamental. And of course, Öcalan at the time proposed cities without urbanization to all the municipalities in Turkey. But there are many other people, like Braudel was extremely central, especially in his evaluation of economy, the way he evaluated economy and historical time. So together with that, Wallerstein, Andre Günther Frank come into the equation. Foucault comes in terms of power. Hannah Arendt comes in terms of democracy. Maria Mies, Silvia Federici, they are extremely important in terms of women's history and colonization. Adorno, in terms of his critique of Enlightenment and fascism, is really important. But also, I think what's really important is that he really went into depth into the cultural and historical accumulation of the Middle East, of the East in general, you know. He reinterpreted epics like the Gilgamesh epic and the Sumerian tablets, you know. He reinterpreted the different religions. Abraham, Muhammad, you know, Christ, Zoroaster, Mani, and many others. And of course, it all boils down to, again, PKK's own history of struggle and the reinterpretation of that, both in theory and practice.
Thank you so much, Havin, for your very detailed answer. I think even if we go a bit over time, what both of you have to say, of course, will stay on the YouTube channel. And I think what you have to say should be shared, because I know already from the comments we're getting that people are following us closely. So just to remind people again, feel free to ask questions on the YouTube function, on the comment section, and we'll try to answer them at the end. And it's really great to see how you're both referring to what the other person has said. So I think this is a very good rhythm as well. So now moving on further to practice, as Havin also mentioned, we shouldn't think of, and both of you actually have said, we shouldn't think of building forms of freedom solely as a mechanic process, but it requires a shift, a transformation in social relations, a mentality shift. So both of you have visited Rojava in recent years. So Janet, you have visited Rojava 3 times in the recent years. The first time we actually went together, and you were able to follow the process over the years actually of social transformation in Rojava. So can you share some of your observations with us? And I know you have prepared some photos for us to show. Janet?
All right, not to belabor it too much. So of course, since I had been working with Murray for all those years and talking about democracy, I was very interested to see how democracy was developing in Rojava. That was the thing I was really most interested in for all the visits there that I made. And I have to say one thing. I remember the day when Murray signed the contracts for the Turkish translations of some of his books. And I remember he put the contract in the envelope, and I went and I mailed it in a mailbox, and I thought, nothing will happen with this. And it's actually one of the most important things that he did, because it made it possible for Mr. Ocalan to read books in Turkish. And I have to say that when Murray was writing about, those recreating the fabric of communal political society through citizens' assemblies, he was writing in a place where it had to be recreated, right? Americans living very separately in suburbia, driving in their cars together, living in their houses together, watching TV by themselves. He thought that organizing a communalist politics would be simultaneously a way to build community, because Americans would have to come together in order to govern themselves communally. And this is sort of how I always thought of it. So it came as a big surprise that people in another part of the world had adopted it. And I have to say that when I heard Murray talking about individualism and individuality as opposed to communal societies, it was very abstract to me. I believed him, I understood what he meant, and intellectually, but it wasn't until I got to Kurdistan that I saw, because in Kurdistan, you didn't have to go to all the trouble to recreate communal bonds. You didn't have to try to get people to live collectively and overcome their isolation, because they already were. And this is, I think, crucial for the development of Democratic Confederalism in Kurdistan, because, when I talk to Americans about building these citizens' assemblies, they say, yes, but we move around all the time. but it was already there in place. So this is an image here of remember I mentioned the structures, the different tiers. So this is a base level. This is a commune in a residential street in Kamishlo from 2014. You can see there's people of genders and ethnicities mixed together, but maybe not so much, but still there. Can I have the next picture? This is an urban commune. This was 2019. This is a village commune these are Arabs in a village near the Euphrates. And just like in Vermont, where town meetings meet in schools, here they are meeting in elementary school, these men like squeezing themselves into students' desks in order to participate in their commune. And you notice that they're really all men. You see, there was actually one woman at this meeting, but we'll get to that problem later. But the next one, please. This man in the purple shirt, so he's the delegate to the next level up, right? Remember I talked about these mandated recallable delegates? So that's Jamal, he's to the next level up. Next, please. This is back in Kamishlo. This is a meeting of a neighborhood council. So you notice there's 8 people, 4 men and 4 women. That's because the delegates from the street, the pairs of them, 1 man and 1 woman, represent a commune in their residential street. So it's okay. And then at that level of the neighborhood meeting, they send delegates to this city council. This is the Kobani City Council sign. We'll go on to the next one. Oh no, there's a meeting there's an image of the city council. This is something else. I'm sorry. Well, in any case, let's get rid of this one. So let's make this go bye-bye. This is a women's meeting that I don't think we're going to have time to talk about. So could you make this go away, please? Okay. So yes. So I have to say it was very gratifying to see this development, and there's also additions to it that I don't think Bookchin could ever have foreseen. For example, for each of the different levels up there, and there's maybe 6 or 7 of them going up to this, all through this self-administration. Each of them has committees. There are 10 committees dealing with peace, dealing with economics, dealing with self-defense, dealing with the justice system, dealing with women, dealing with all different aspects. There are 10 committees. They exist at the commune level, the neighborhood level, the district level, the city level, the regional level, the cantonal level. They in each of them, this is a way of, this is actually the work that these structures do. They work on these different areas. And the fact that the same work areas exist from the bottom all the way up to the top makes it possible to integrate, so that everybody is working on them together. That solutions are found at the lowest possible level, at the closest to the base as possible. That the input of everybody is considered, and decisions are made. And actually, in some ways, as I was looking at this, do you have this the chart? Well, never, doesn't really matter. They were. Someone said to me. That the self-administration is for taking care of people, and the SDC, the Syrian Democratic Council, is for waging the war. And in a way, it seemed like a giant social service agency, in a way, controlled by the democracy, to make sure that everybody is taken care of and that everyone is participating. It seemed like the embodiment of that communal aspect of the society. And I just want to say one thing, just because I did have to point out that that Arab village was all men. So can we look at image 8 or image 9? No. Okay.
I'm not sure what
I'll just talk about it. Yeah. I'll just talk about it. So yeah. This problem had to be addressed, and some very brilliant people in the self-administration decided, especially after the Arab areas were liberated during the course of the war against Islamic State, to set up women's academies to teach specifically Arab women that they can and must participate in the democracy. And so I was fortunate to, yes, okay, this is the one in Raqqa. You can see the sign for Raqqa on the top. So there's these guys are talking about how there's no difference between Arabs and Kurds in terms of fighting against Islamic State. In fact, they almost seemed irritated by the question when I asked them about, about Arabs and Kurds fighting together. They seemed irritated by the question. Of course, there's no difference. We all fought together. But in terms of the getting back to the school, I'm sorry, this is all getting a little jumbled here, but getting back to the school for women. So I visited on a day toward the end of their session. There we are. They're learning about democracy. So the teacher is giving a lecture, asking them, what is democracy? What is self-rule? It goes back to Athens, but women are included. It means we have control over our lives. It means women have control. It means women are free to do what they want. This is just, I took this in and I thought, I wish I could bring these people back to the United States. I wish we could get this lesson in the United States, talking about the importance of participating in your democratic institutions in order to save them. And this is happening in Tabqa and Raqqa. These are places where Islamic State had previously been selling women like them as chattel slaves in the marketplace. Now here they were learning to be full participants. So when I look at this image, I see this is the solution to the problem posed by that picture of the men in the town meeting, in the commune meeting in the Euphrates Valley, in that Arab village. These are the women who will go in there and populate those Arab assemblies so that they are truly gender equal. And I think that's just a fantastic hope and fantastic prospects. The next picture after that, the one with the sign for Raqqa, showed the husbands coming to pick them up at the end of the session, because they had just graduated from this session. And we were asking what's going to happen. You know, they go back to their homes. How will they be able to preserve what they've learned? And the principal of the school told me, no, they have support groups. Each of them is part of a group where they can talk to each other and support each other and help each other continue what they've learned even back in their daily lives. So I just found this incredibly moving, and hope you don't mind if I shared it with you. So.
Thank you so much, Janet, for giving us such a amazing, and I mean, there's so much to be described when you talk about system change, not just social relations that need to change, but also the structures of organizing, of coming together, filling new practices with new meanings. So thank you so much for giving us a sense of that. So now over to you, Havin, again. Could you talk about the perspectives and limitations in the implementation of democratic confederalism? Of course, Janet has mentioned some of them, and both of you have said that we can't expect social change to come overnight. A very long and patient process is required for that. So the Kurdish freedom movement stresses that this model is also not just limited to the Kurdish question. It has much more universal appeal. So can democratic confederalism be a regional perspective in the Middle East?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think it's proving itself that it's not just for the Middle East, but even around the globe, because of all the framework and the universality of the problem that we're talking about. You know, we are seeing that what the Kurdish society has been experiencing is not singular. It's experienced in different ways, you know. Maybe the Blacks experience it much more visibly, you know, the Kurdish experience is becoming more and more visible as well, but the Black experience, the racism, the colonization, it's very vivid. Women's oppression, exploitation is very vivid. Therefore, I think democratic confederalism as such is without any limitations, I would say. The only limitations would be either to think that, yeah, okay, you know, change doesn't occur overnight, and not do anything about it overnight, you know. So yes, change doesn't occur every night, but every night an increment of it occurs. So it accumulates, you know. I think it was Raoul Zibechi in Building Free Life. He said, you know, we didn't even notice the Kurdish freedom movement until Kobani happened, you know, because it incremented, and that accumulation, when the time came, actually erupted, and it showed it was ready to take the moment and show how a new life, a life without any oppression can be actually imagined, or even the questioning of meaning of life can be imagined. So I think in democratic confederalism, the focus is really on the local community and really on shared homeland. I think this has been the case like since the formation of the PKK, I have to say, that they embraced Kurdish ethnicity, culture, language, because it was an identity that was being dismantled. And this is like against humanity. It's a crime against humanity, you know. So, but it gives it enough value and preciousness, and it doesn't give it an unnecessary weight. Like, for example, let me explain how the movement and Abdullah Ocalan treated the different communities or the different beliefs in the past too. You know, we are not talking about excluding people who are thinking different to you. So you're not being divisive in a sense that you bring out the negativity in people's, but you try to bring in what everybody will gain from this vision of life if it was to take hold. It's like when we talk about women's struggle and freedom, Öcalan didn't say to the men, okay, you're all no good, whatever. He tried to convince them, like, look, if woman is free, you're going to be even better too. You're going to be free as well. You're also a slave because, whatever. Or he tried very hard, in fact, to build bridges between Kurds and the Turkish peoples. He tried very hard with the Arabic people. In one of my trips to Rojava, I also went to Minbij, and I met somebody there who was he was also in the council. He had met Öcalan. He was Arabic, and he was the head of a big tribe. And he met Öcalan back in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, in the 80s, and he was like with a lot of passion telling us about him, or even within the Kurds themselves, I mean, divided between four nations, nobody knew one another anymore. So what happened is that a person from Rojava went into, Ahmed or into Istanbul or to Dersim to be an activist there so that these bridges would be built. So what I'm trying to say is that um, the through this shared homeland and and our own needs, enchantment of life, joy, meaning to life, what you're doing is without excluding people, unless it's the aggressors who are trying to completely destroy you, of course, but you're trying to bring in everybody, so you have this process of change and transformation. Because if I or you, Dilar, or Janet is 100%, we are free, it doesn't mean anything. If the society is not moving together, it is illusion. And I guess this is the success of capitalism in that sense. As Janet was mentioning, this biopower, is being seeped into the society and this egotistical individual so much that we are made to believe that as an individual we can be free, and we are seeing that this is nonsense, of course, that the way to enslave the individual is to detach it from this community and the society it has. So I guess it has a huge potential in every way because of the way that its theory and its practice is structured, the mechanisms in place. We're not talking about uninstitutionalizations here. We are talking about institutionalizing, structuring the women's movement, structuring and institutionalizing. And I don't mean this institutionalization in a negative sense. On the contrary, we have to make sure that from one generation to another, not only do we pass on these accumulations, but also they can build up on these accumulations. And I guess this is the success of Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement, that they didn't deny where they are coming from, where they came from, but they gave self-critique and they built on this. So this is why it's so perfect for the Middle East, because the peoples there, the memory is still vivid. Armenians, Assyrians, Arabs, Kurds, different beliefs, and lots of different peoples are still there. It's a shared homeland. So it's basically, and women, of course, it's her homeland. So, and of course, ecology. So all of these find a resonance and find a way of coming together in the embodiment of this democratic confederalism. But it only works if, we decide that as an individual, we should also transform and change, and we have a vision of a different life.
Thank you so much, Havin. This is so such a great connection also to the last question that I'm going to ask to Janet, namely, based on your experience with the Kurdish freedom movement, your trips to Rojava, your reading, and your own translation work as well, where would you locate the Rojava revolution and the experience of the Kurdish freedom movement? I mean, the concept of democratic confederalism, specifically in the international context of the left, now that the left is seeking for more perspectives and trying to unite struggles as well. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm going to construe the term the left in a very broad sense, because it seems to me that in many ways, what is being the kind of the duality that we are working with now is in many ways about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about inclusiveness versus exclusiveness in ways that, and I think that the left and other kind of left of center people can share some perspectives. So forgive me for that. And also, I also have to say that in the years since I've been there back and forth, what keeps cross-referencing in my head is correspondences, differences and similarities between the United States and Northeast Syria. It's now, as it's now called, Northeast Syria or Rojava. And especially the problem of multi-ethnic democracy. Okay, so obviously that's what, and I'm going to use the word democracy in a very broad sense, because I understand that American democracy is in many ways only a very, very pale shadow of democracy, but at least it still has some democratic features. So I'm going to refer to that. What the attempt that is being made here is to create a multi-ethnic democracy. And the attempt is being made in Northeast Syria to create a multi-ethnic democracy with very different planes and very different levels and with very different degrees of success. So, and it's a multi-ethnic democracy is a problem because it's something that I think the left and everybody who's concerned with democracy has to grapple with, because there's a lot of prejudice and there's a lot of legacies of colonialism and racism and white supremacy that have to be grappled with before democracy can be perfected, either at the state level in the United States or in Rojava. So Rojava, as we know, it's a very multi-ethnic place. There are Kurds, there's Arabs, there's Chechens, there's Christians, Assyrians, all kinds of peoples. And one of the I think the starting points in 2012 after the revolution was, how do we bring everybody together into democratic confederalism? And when I visited there with you, Dilar, in December of 2014, I remember that it seemed, if I may say so, a little shaky at times, and sometimes maybe a little aspirational. When we went to, I remember we went to a training center for the Asayish and another one for the YPG. And in both cases, the people where we were talking to were very emphatic. We teach our students here no revenge taking, no revenge taking. In other words, Kurds can't take, now that Kurds have some power, they can't take revenge on the Arabs. That's forbidden. And apparently, you know, for many decades, the Assad regime had told the Arabs in Syria, if the Kurds ever come to power, they're going to, you know, kill you. They're going to try to destroy you the way we tried to destroy them. And so I kept hearing no revenge taking, which actually made me think maybe there's a problem. I don't know. It seemed a little insecure to me. That was 2014. So if I can compare that to what I saw in 2019, what happened in those 5 years was the war against Islamic State. It was a war that started out, I mean, we started out with the YPG and the YPJ fighting ISIS, and then there had to be some Arab battalions brought in because of the coalition with the U.S.-led the alliance with the U.S.-led coalition. And pretty soon, by the time I was there in 2019, there are actually more Arabs in the SDF there than Kurds. There actually became the process of liberating the villages brought Arabs in, and absolutely, I think, made that alliance like concrete. So that when I showed you the picture of the Arabs in that village, and we asked them, you know, how are things with the Kurds? They're like, don't even ask. It's not even a problem. There's no difference. I think the wartime experience solidified that ethnic inclusiveness, because the people who are fighting from different ethnicities, they learn to depend on each other. You know, when you're in a battle, you have to depend on each other for your life. And it also brought home the message that the future of Northeast Syria itself depended on everybody getting along and everybody supporting each other, that their destinies were locked together. And so everywhere I went, I saw just the most, and now granted, I'm an American woman coming around with a microphone with some cameras behind me and asking people questions. And so, you know, people, that can affect what people say, but everyone I asked did say, just emphasize that this was not even an issue anymore, that it might have been 5 years ago, but was not even an issue anymore. And that was so gratifying to see. And similarly, for women, you know, back in the United States, you know, as soon as a woman starts getting some power, there's a huge misogynist backlash. Woman in power, there's whole sections of American society that can't tolerate a woman in power. So when I was in the Northeast in last year, I thought there has to be some male backlash going on here. There just has to be. I mean, it can't be that different. And I have to tell you that every time I asked, we would go up to men in the street and say, what's all this about women in power? How does that work for you? And they say, don't even ask. It's so natural. It's such normal. Again, you know, there's this thing of waving the hands, waving the question away, because it was so natural and so normal and so obvious. And I have to say, I think, again, one reason for this is the war. I think that women, the strength of women in the society was solidified by the war against Islamic State. So just as different ethnic groups learned that they could depend on each other, men and women learned that they could depend on each other. That neighborhood council meeting that I showed you a picture of in Kobani was very interesting, because they said that women, all the men there said, women prove themselves. They prove that they can fight, and nothing can ever take that away. And there's no difference now. It wasn't even an issue. And in terms, when I asked, there was a man at that meeting, his name was Nabo. When I asked about Kurdish-Arab relations, he said something that has stuck in that I can't get out of my head, that I've never been able to get out of my head. He said, our blood got mixed. Our blood got mixed, meaning in the fighting against Islamic State. It's so beautiful. And there's a sense of confidence and assuredness of the multi-ethnic part of multi-ethnic democracy. There was something that I could only dream of in this country. And I think it stands as a beacon for the left, for all parts of anything left of center around the world today, that it can be done, that and that it must be done, because we are all dependent on each other. Our futures are locked together in this world. And so I think in that there are many senses one could answer your question, and I think Haven has a lot to say about it too. But in terms of this problematic that I personally am dealing with, I found it just the most enthralling experience. And it was borne out, the validity of our blood got mixed was borne out when the Turkish-backed jihadists invaded in October, and people thought that the Arabs would just run away, that they wouldn't fight, that they would just abandon the SDF, but they didn't at all. They didn't at all. And that's, you know, even under the worst, that horrendous situation, the bonds persisted. So I wish more of the world could know about this, and that the Rojava experience could become a beacon for peoples everywhere who are grappling with this problem.
Thank you so much, Janet, also for sharing your feelings about these things. And I think it's really beautiful to see how we started out by introducing different contexts of intellectual histories and movements, and how they, in interesting ways, have come together, influenced each other, and are branching out towards the universal, starting from the local yet not so local, when we consider it in terms of a 5,000-year-old history of domination and freedom. So we have some time, not too much, for questions that have been asked. So it's 3 questions in total, and I'll ask you to answer them briefly, but they are, again, quite profound questions. So it's okay if you don't answer them as much as you would like. So the first question is from somebody in the comment section on YouTube. And one key issue I see in the process of bringing democratic confederalism construction into urban/modern societies is the monopoly of violence by state and capitalism. So the actual question is, what would be some insights on dealing with institutional monopoly violence and control over political and social processes? Who would like to answer this question?
I guess I can say a few things. I think we also need to be able to imagine the urban a little bit, you know. I guess when we think of an alternative way of living, I guess we should not think of New York as it is, as big as it is today, for example, you know. What we're seeing is that the enlargement of the urban against the rural comes at a huge price throughout the 5,000 years of human history, especially with the onset of civilization. The more urbanized we become, the easier it is to control the people and also to be able to economically, the economic life of people is much easier to control. Therefore, I also think that we need to start from there too. But as it is today, I think we need to look at ways of not being complicit any longer with the capitalist modernity way of life. And what does this mean? For example, can we think of, you know, how food security, housing wise, we can resituate ourselves? How can we, and how do we become independent in these sorts of in these major issues? Because what we're seeing is state is taking charge due to these very, very principal needs, you know, elementary needs of the human being and its society. So therefore, how do we actually come out of this vicious circle? You know, I guess, you know, maybe we can't, you know, we can't readily do it like overnight, maybe like Rojava, and we explained it's not overnight. But, you know, how do we make our own media? How do we make our own education? You know, because as I said, what the state assumes is all the different organs of the society, and the society is just sitting there and just, you know, being restructured and recreated by those ruling. So I would say that this is extremely important. How do we get outside of the radar of the state? How do we get outside of it so much? Because if you're a wage earner, you know, we can struggle against it to a point, because we are dependent on actually the processing of this world order. So I guess, you know, this is an important thing, and I think we've come to that point because people thought that if they worked really hard, you know, like the Kurds, for example, you would know this, Dilar, too, in Turkey or elsewhere, they thought the only way to break out of this vicious circle is to get an education. You know, go to university, get an education. And all of them, especially in the early days, wanted to become either teachers or lawyers, you know, because they thought they'll defend their rights before the system and they'll teach the kids, you know, the right things, whatever. And I think, you know, they found out very quickly that even if they became rich, even if they had a status, it didn't actually really mean anything come end of the day. And I think people are finding this right now, even in America, you know. So I think the real revolution becomes when you stop living on the privileges that are constructed for you, which enslaves you. This is true for men, this is true for the white, you know, etc., etc. This is true for black man over black woman, or Kurdish men over Kurdish women, you know. So therefore, I think that first of all, we all need to make a rupture and make sure that we don't contribute to the continuation of capitalist modernity, because we are at that point.
Thank you so much. Janet, would you like to add something to that? Or I can ask you the next question, which is for you. Actually, I'll ask that, and maybe you can add what you wanted to say to this question, because I think it's related. It's okay. What is the alternative to liberty from? So maybe you can connect that to the previous question, if you like.
All right, just something about the previous question. So one of the fabulous visions that I encountered in Rojava is the vision of eliminating prisons altogether. And I'm going to talk about the question domestically, because I think when you have an external enemy, you need to have people in arms to fight off Islamic State or to fight Turkey or whatever. But in terms of domestically, you know, in the US, obviously, we have a very militarized police force now. And there's a lot of discussion about demilitarizing and defunding and breaking up the police forces in order to, and turning over their functions to more socially oriented agents, to mental health care, to social agencies and so on, which have been woefully defunded for so long in favor of funding the police. So in Rojava, it seems like they're so much farther ahead of that, because the justice system that I described that functions from the very base communal level up to the top is very intent on resolving disputes in a face-to-face manner at the lowest possible level. So they have peace and justice peace committees where disputes are resolved before they can get out of hand. It's a very talky kind of solution, as opposed to a solution that involves the use of force. And I could only hope that the use of especially domestic violence around the world can again look to this model of resolving disputes. Maybe it's the hard way to talk out a problem, to talk out a difference, but it's also the most socially viable and creative and productive way that prevents problems from getting worse. So, and in terms of, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? What is freedom to? Right. So yes, that's I was hoping to clarify that when I first spoke, because freedom from, as I say, freedom from domination, and the pendant to that is freedom to. By the way, this is a distinction that came from a 20th century thinker called Isaiah Berlin. Okay, so freedom from means freedom from tyranny. Freedom to is positive freedom, but freedom to what? And that's what I was trying to emphasize. In a communal society, you have the freedom that supports you in what your best efforts are doing. Supports your efforts to be socially meaningful, to make contributions to the society. That is freedom to, and it means you're marshaling your best resources to contributing to the society in which you live, to helping the people around you, to improving, to trying to make a better world, to trying to behave morally, trying to caring for your neighbors. That's freedom too, because it presupposes it's not a libertarian kind of freedom, but it's the kind of freedom that recognizes that we're all interdependent on each other. And yeah, you're right that freedom from is much easier to define. Isaiah Berlin thought so too. And I think a lot of Murray's work, but is a question to answer, is an effort to answer that question in terms of by creating a society of communal freedom, so, as opposed to individual freedom.
Thank you, Janet. And now I'll ask you both the last question before we come to an end. So this is also your chance to add anything that you feel like you didn't. I mean, you spoke about many things, so it's amazing to be able to do that in such a short time. So the very last question is a question that people often ask. It's how would you answer Western people or feminists when they confront you with the fact that the Kurdistan women's movement, Kurdistan women's movement is based on and following a man's ideas and aims? What would you respond to that?
Havin, do you want to take it first? Since it's,
I
don't mind. I have things to say too, but.
I think, I think they, first of all, this is an attitude that really, is very Orientalist, I think. It puts, women, I mean, the Turkish state says about this to the Kurdish people, or the European states say this to the Kurdish people and say, why do you need him? Why do you need a leader? Or whatever. So I think it's terrible to put the woman like an object in this, The Kurdish Freedom Women's Movement is an amazing agent, and it has been an amazing agent since the 80s, through its involvement in the thought process as well as practical in its praxis as well. There is also, of course, the issue of the depth in which, the profundity with which Abdullah Öcalan is approaching both the human history and, together with that, human colonization, which is called civilization, and its main pillar being women's colonization and exploitation. So I think that, so therefore seeing that, as I said, like I think in the first discussion or whatever, neither the Kurds nor the women are not following anyone sheepishly, This is all a result of a huge process of doing together, dialoguing together, and Abdullah Öcalan drawing conclusions through his own experience, his own observations, and from those of his comrades, whether women or men. I think we would be mistaken if we do not see his role in the way not only the theory, like genealogy, which is being developed by the Kurdish women's movement, but also that far in the in depths of history, how enslavement of women was the first kind of enslavement, and how this is being exposed by Abdullah Öcalan, but also how he has actually pushed with a lot of courage inside the organization during all these 45, 50 years of amazingly difficult and complex times, to make sure that women, amidst themselves, that they would actually overcome their own roles that were given to them, and also determine the new kind of roles that they felt that fitted them, So I think that one needs to give away that Orientalism and have a look at from this kind of perspective. So I think I would pull to Öcalan at the very far left of the radical democracy that he is actually a proponent and a theorist of, and he has struggled for this himself, both in his own personage. He talks about this. He had his own experiences throughout time. So it has been a constant change and transformation, both for him and also for the movement, but also for the woman and the men in that movement, as well as the society. So I think we should look at it from this perspective. What has this meant for all the different agents within this movement and how they have come out of it, instead of framing it this way, where it automatically is negative. So, but I would say it's been a constant journey, above all for him, but for everybody else involved in this. And for that, read the books. I'm going to say that again. Find them on ocalanbooks.com and see, the transformation that he also has gone through. So it's an enormous effort, both intellectually and in real life.
Would you like to add something? Okay, go ahead.
I can just echo what Haven said, that she's not the first Kurdish woman I've heard say that it wasn't a matter of Öcalan opening his mouth and saying free women and everybody fell into line. That it was a big struggle. It was a big struggle within the movement, especially in the 1990s. And I don't know the details. I wasn't there. I'm not privy to it, but this is what I understand, that it was a big struggle. And secondly, just to close, just because a man said it, that it doesn't matter who says it if it's correct, right? If it's right, then fine. Then the Kurdish people are very lucky to have a leader who is willing to be pushed, or to be pushed by women, to make a statement, or to generate statements in his own right, or to affirm the power of women, whatever it is. The Kurdish people are very fortunate to have a leader who is open to the liberation of women and who pushes for it and affirms that it was absolutely necessary. And I think it's kind of narrow-minded to keep taking it back to the fact that it came from a man. So, yeah. Sorry. Hello?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both for your answers to this question. And I would also like to add, I think, especially for my generation who are now benefiting from the decades of struggle, I think we can say that having a person like Abdullah Öcalan at the forefront of the Kurdish liberation struggle has also enabled a wider women's movement to grow because of his support for the liberation struggle. So what I'll do now is, first of all, thank you so much for both of you for your contributions, for making this event such an exciting and interesting one. I know for a fact that many people have been watching us and to contribute with their own thoughts as well. So we'll wrap up now with some book recommendations in support of the things that you have said. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. I can.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't sure. So the first one, just to echo some of the things that you have mentioned, this is the book, The Sociology of Freedom, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the third of a 5-volume manifesto of a democratic civilization, written by Abdullah Öcalan from prison. It's the most recent one coming out in the English language, translated by Havin, and it's very much an analysis also of the positivist nature of the social sciences and why it is important for social movements, for resistance movements to restructure and find new ways of critiquing how we analyze life. So it's also the book that first introduced the concept of gynology, which is the Kurdish women's movement's proposal for a new new science of women life, as a critique of the male-dominated character of the ways in which intellectual history has developed. So I don't want to give away too much, because you should buy this book. It has just come out. It's been published by PM Press, and of course also the other 2 books, on civilization and capitalism, which are the first two volumes of the series, also translated by Havin. Then next we have Beyond State, Power and Violence, which is a book that was written actually nearly 15 years ago, around that time, again in the early years of Öcalan's imprisonment. And this was the book that first presented his critique, his break with the old paradigm. Of course, that break had been going on, as also having mentioned, since the 90s with the critique of state socialism and other things. But here is his first profound and thick presentation of his critique of power and why a new paradigm, and this is before Democratic Confederalism was presented to the world as such. So this is actually older than the 5-volume Manifesto for Democratic Civilization series. And this is now available for pre-order also on PM Press. Next, we have Building Free Life. And this is an amazing collection of essays written by activists, by intellectuals, by freedom-loving people from around the world that have engaged with Abdullah Öcalan's thoughts. So among them, we have, as you can see also on the cover, Antonio Negri, David Graeber, Radha de Souza, Emmanuel Wallerstein before he passed away, Nazan Üstündağ, and many other people who have engaged with his thinking, not only from an intellectual perspective, but also from their own activist perspectives. So this is basically a response to Abdullah Öcalan's request to develop his ideas, to respond to them. Of course, due to his imprisonment, he doesn't have the chance to have an intellectual dialogue with people because of the isolation. So this can also be interpreted as an effort of breaking the isolation. Also, next we have The Art of Freedom, which is, as I mentioned, The Art of Freedom, A Brief History of the Kurdish Liberation Struggle, is Havin's forthcoming book that you can now pre-order on PM Press. And that gives us, perhaps for the first time, a deep history of how the movement has developed. Of course, I haven't read it yet, but from the description, it's how the movement has developed, and also its paradigm shift, the struggles, the obstacles, and where it came to today, especially focusing on the aspect of a self-critique that the movement has undergone. I'm sorry, Havin, for summarizing the book in such a rough way, but we all look very much forward to reading this. This is also available for pre-order. And then we have the books that and the so-called conference books, which are published as a result of the conference of the Network for an Alternative Quest. So this is a network that is especially led by the International Initiative for the Freedom of Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan, that has held conferences in the past in 2012, 2015, and 2017. Unfortunately, this year's conference had to be cancelled because of the coronavirus, but we all look forward to the next one. Every time these conferences have brought together hundreds of people from around the world, activists, social movement people, intellectuals who have critiques of capitalist modernity, and also sorry, not cancelled, but postponed, who have not only critiques of capitalist modernity, but who want to be among the forces, the groups that will build democratic modernity. So these books are amazing because they have a collection of essays from speeches, basically, from all the different contributors who come from all parts of the world. Then Democratic Autonomy in Northern Kurdistan was, I think, the first book that Janet has translated that relates to the Kurdish freedom movement. That was a work done by the Germany-based group Tatort Kurdistan, and their findings of the implementation of Abdullah Öcalan's ideas in Northern Kurdistan within the borders of the Turkish state. So this includes interviews with the women's movement, with the ecology movement, with the council and assembly structure. So it's a very good documentation of what was built up before the Turkish state has cracked down on all of these structures. So before the revolution in Rojava, these things had been built already in northern Kurdistan, and the Rojava revolution could refer to the experiences in northern Kurdistan. And then with the revolution in Rojava, northern Kurdistan, once again, especially during the peace process, could again build on their experience. So this is a good historical documentation that was translated by Janet. Janet also translated the next book that I'm going to mention, which is Revolution in Rojava, written by Michael Knapp, Anja Flach, and Ercan Ayboğa, who are three activists that are part of the Kurdish freedom struggle. It's basically, it was the first book in the English language that documented the ways in which the Rojava revolution came to be. The historical background is included, the establishment of the first structure in the midst of the Syrian war. So this book has been translated into many different languages, and it focuses on the different aspects of what has been built up in Rojava. It's also available in different languages, and I should say that the Öcalan books as well, if you go and visit the page Öcalan books, you'll find, we can put that in the link, in the YouTube link later, you will see that many of the books have been translated into German already, but also Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and other languages. This book has been translated by Janet Beale. So she also translated the 3-volume autobiography of Sakine Cansız, or codename Sara. This is the first one, called My Whole Life Was a Struggle, and the second one is called Prison Memoir of a Kurdish Revolutionary, and it basically is the the autobiography of one of the most important revolutionaries, in the sense that she laid some of the foundations on which later on thousands of Kurdish women could build. You can also download, I forgot to mention this, the conference books, and also some of the other things that I mentioned for free on öcalanbooks.com. Next, we have a work that has been written by Janet Beale. It's called Ecology or Catastrophe, The Life of Murray Bookchin. And as she mentioned, she has been very much part of Murray Bookchin's intellectual and activist journey. So she's highly qualified to assess the resonance of his ideas and the development of them. So this gives a great overview of, so this is not translated by Janet, of course, this is her own work. And it's very interesting and contributes to our understanding of how we should interpret and read Murray Bookchin's work. And then the last two things that I want to introduce are Ecology of Freedom and Urbanization Without Cities. Both of them are works that were written decades ago by Murray Bookchin, and they tell us more about his theories on the rise of states, the change in social relations, the cancerous structure of urbanization as we know it, and why it's also important for us to undo hierarchy and domination in the realm of our relationship with nature. So, of course, I've given very rough and inadequate overviews of all these fantastic books. I highly recommend all of them. And you can check them out. You can pre-order some of them you can download for free, and you should definitely take advantage of that, because one thing that our friends here have told us is that we should read. Reading is something we can do now, especially in times of COVID-19. I just want to say one last thing. This event, as I mentioned, was organized jointly between Jenny and Cevak Azat. Cevak Azat works primarily in the German language, but more English events are going to come up. So please follow them on Twitter or check out their homepage. And actually tomorrow, Jenny is holding another event, which is called The Politics of Prisons, Women's Critiques and Alternatives. And it will be a panel of activists from different parts of the world. We have 2 Black activists from the United States. We have 1 activist from the Philippines, 1 activist from Turkey and northern Kurdistan, 1 from Palestine. And it will be a great event where we will speak about feminist perspectives on prison systems, especially in light of the recent developments. So Havin and Janet, thank you so much again for everything. You have summarized very important questions that everybody should be asking themselves at this point. I don't know if you have anything else to say other than that, but I would like to thank you so much for joining this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilar. It was an honor to participate. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you so
you,
much.
Dilar and Divaka Azad. It was an amazing program. Thanks.
Thank you. And so, goodbye. Take good care.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.